I never thought much about homeowners associations until we moved to Oak Ridge Estates last spring. The neighborhood seemed like a perfect slice of suburban paradise: manicured lawns, elegant street lamps, and a community pool that could have been featured in a resort brochure. After years of apartment living, I had finally saved enough for a down payment on the modest 3-bedroom with a garden that reminded me of my childhood home. My father moved in with me 3 weeks after we settled. The doctors had recommended someone stay with him during recovery from his back surgery, a lingering reminder of his 22 years as a Navy SEAL. Dad had always been formidable, even in his 60s, with calloused hands and the quiet vigilance that never quite left those who had served in special operations. The surgery had temporarily diminished his physical capabilities, but not his awareness. We established a routine quickly. Mornings began with coffee on the porch while watching the neighborhood come alive. Neighbors would wave as they collected newspapers or walked their dogs. It felt like we had discovered a secret sanctuary, a place where people still knew each other and looked out for one another. For the first time in years, Dad seemed to relax, the hypervigilance that had followed him from combat zones finally easing in this peaceful setting. The first letter arrived exactly 1 month after we moved in. It came on expensive cardstock with the Oak Ridge Estates HOA logo embossed in gold. Notice of violation, unauthorized garden modification, it read, citing Section 7.3 of Community Guidelines. I was confused. We had planted nothing, changed nothing. The letter demanded immediate correction and included a $200 fine. Clerical error, I assumed, setting it aside to address later. Dad read it after I left for work, his expression darkening as he scrutinized the official-looking document. "Have you noticed how the neighbors avoid eye contact?" he asked that evening as we sat down for dinner. I had not, but once he mentioned it, I could not unsee it. The next morning, Mrs. Winters from across the street hurried inside when she saw us. The Johnsons abruptly ended their conversation when we approached at the mailbox. At the community center, I found a directory with contact information for the HOA board. The president, Richard Mercer, had an impressive title listed beneath his name: Former Director of Private Security Operations. His photograph showed a man in his 50s with a military-style haircut and a smile that never reached his eyes. 3 days later, a second violation notice arrived, this time for improper trash can placement with an increased fine. I had followed the guidelines meticulously, placing our bins exactly where specified, retrieving them promptly after collection. Something was wrong. "Did you notice the black SUV?" Dad asked that evening, gesturing subtly toward the window. A vehicle with tinted windows beyond legal limits was parked 3 houses down. No markings, no visible license plate. Third time this week I have seen it. The next morning, I overheard fragments of conversation at the community mailboxes. "The Richardsons moved out last night," one woman whispered. "Just packed up and left after the night visit." "What night visit?" I asked, causing both women to startle. Their eyes darted around before the older one leaned closer. "Nothing, just neighborhood gossip." They hurried away, looking over their shoulders. That afternoon, a third notice arrived, this one threatening lien proceedings for accumulated violations. Dad placed it on the counter with unusual care, his expression one I had seen only in old photographs from his deployment days. "Something is not right here," he said quietly, watching through the blinds as the black SUV made another slow pass. I felt the first chill of what would become our neighborhood nightmare. These are not normal HOA practices. He was right. We had unknowingly stepped into territory more dangerous than mere community guidelines. The perfect neighborhood facade was beginning to crack, revealing something far more sinister beneath its manicured surface. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock in the community center. I arrived early, violation notices and documentation in hand, determined to address the situation reasonably. The room filled quickly with neighbors who avoided making eye contact with me. 20 residents, all seated in perfect rows, shoulders hunched forward as if trying to disappear. Richard Mercer called the meeting to order precisely on time. He stood at the podium with military posture, an American flag pin gleaming on his lapel. His opening remarks praised the community standards that made Oak Ridge Estates the premier living environment in the county. Each word was delivered with practiced precision. When the floor opened for community concerns, I raised my hand. The room fell silent. Every head turned. Mercer acknowledged me with cold efficiency. "I have received multiple violation notices for infractions I did not commit," I explained, keeping my voice level. "I have documentation showing compliance with all guidelines. I request clarification on the inspection process." Mercer's smile never wavered. "All violations are documented by our compliance team with photographic evidence. Section 14.2 of the bylaws clearly states the board has sole discretion in determining violations. Your appeal will be noted and reviewed at our convenience." "May I see the photographic evidence?" I asked. "Community members are not entitled to enforcement documentation," he responded immediately. Section 22.7 clearly outlines the confidentiality of compliance procedures. "I never received a copy of these bylaws," I said, noticing several neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Distribution of bylaws is the responsibility of your real estate agent at closing. The association cannot be held accountable for your failure to review governing documents." He moved on to the next agenda item without allowing further discussion. Walking home through twilight streets, I noticed the black SUV again. It crawled past our house, slowing momentarily before continuing around the corner. The windows were tinted so darkly that the driver remained invisible. Upon reaching our driveway, I found fresh survey stakes placed along our property line, stakes that had not been there that morning. Dad was waiting at the kitchen table, laptop open to security camera websites. "We need to upgrade our home security," he stated without preamble. I told him about the meeting, about Mercer, about the survey stakes. "This is not normal HOA behavior," Dad said, his voice quiet but certain. "This is intimidation." Over the next week, Dad installed systems that would have impressed his former military commanders. Inconspicuous cameras covered every approach to our home, motion sensors linked to our phones, reinforced locks on all doors and windows. He worked methodically, his movements precise despite his recent surgery. This was the man who had conducted operations in countries whose names were classified, applying those same skills to protect our home. The fourth violation notice came by certified mail. Unauthorized security modifications, removal required within 48 hours. The fine had doubled. I attempted to call Mercer directly. His assistant informed me he was unavailable for individual member concerns, but would be conducting a property inspection in the near future. That evening, while retrieving the mail, I encountered Sarah from across the street. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before approaching. "Be careful," she whispered. "They have their own enforcement team. Not police, not security guards, something else. They conduct night inspections, take photos inside windows. The Richardsons questioned a fine last month. 3 days later, 4 men in tactical gear appeared at midnight for an emergency inspection." Her husband appeared at their door, eyes wide with alarm. "Sarah, come inside, now." She hurried away without another word. That night, reviewing security footage, we spotted a figure in tactical gear measuring our property line at 2 in the morning. The equipment was military-grade, night vision, communications gear, sidearm visible under a jacket emblazoned with HOA enforcement. Dad froze the image, studying it with narrowed eyes. "Those are knockoff tactical vests, but the weapon is real. Glock 19, standard issue for private security contractors." He straightened, wincing slightly from his healing back. "They are playing soldier," he said quietly, "but they do not know what real soldiers are capable of." The next morning, I found a final notice on our door. "Mandatory compliance inspection scheduled. Failure to provide access will result in maximum enforcement measures." No date or time was specified. Dad began preparing. He moved furniture slightly, creating defensive positions not obvious to the casual observer. The pills prescribed for his post-surgery pain remained untouched. He needed clarity, not comfort. 22 years of combat experience focused into methodical preparation for whatever might come. "They want us afraid," he explained, testing the new motion alerts on his phone. "Fear is control, but they have never dealt with someone who spent their career overcoming fear." We did not know then how soon his training would be put to the test, or how violent the confrontation would become. The pounding on our front door jolted me from sleep at exactly 3:17 a.m. 3 sharp, authoritative knocks followed by a voice amplified through what sounded like a megaphone. "HOA enforcement, open up now, emergency inspection." My heart hammered against my ribs as I fumbled for the bedside lamp. Before I could reach it, Dad appeared in my doorway, fully dressed, fully alert. He motioned for me to stay quiet, pointing first to his ear, then toward the back of the house. In the silence between the pounding, I heard it, the soft scrape of footsteps on our back patio. "Call 911, Dad whispered. "Tell them armed intruders are attempting to enter our home. Be specific about our address." His voice was different, not the voice of my father, but the voice of a commander who had led men through the most dangerous situations imaginable. I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers as Dad moved silently toward the front door. The pounding came again, more insistent. Through the security app, I could see 4 men in black uniforms with patches resembling police insignia but reading HOA Enforcement Division. Their tactical vests bulged with equipment. One held what looked like a battering ram. "This is Lawrence County Emergency Services. What is your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice seemed impossibly distant. "Armed intruders are trying to break into our home," I whispered, giving our address. "They claim to be HOA enforcement but are armed and threatening forced entry. Please hurry." Dad positioned himself to the side of the door, then called out, "Identify yourselves and state your legal authority for this visit." HOA Enforcement Division. "We have reports of critical violations requiring immediate inspection. Open the door now, or we will be forced to enter and secure the premises." Dad cracked the door open with the security chain engaged. "This is private property. You have no legal authority to enter without a warrant. Please return during business hours with proper documentation." The response was immediate, a boot wedged into the door jamb, preventing the door from closing. "We have authorization from the association president. Step aside or you will be detained for obstruction." Dad's posture changed subtly. 22 years of combat training condensed into absolute focus. "Remove your foot from my door immediately," he said, voice deadly calm. "We have authority to," the man's words cut off as Dad shifted his weight. I could not see exactly what happened, but the boot disappeared from the doorway with a yelp of pain. Dad secured the door and moved back toward me. "Time to move," he instructed. "Safe room now." The security system chimed, rear motion detector triggered. They were coming in through the back. Dad guided me toward the reinforced interior room we had prepared, his movements fluid despite his recent surgery. I clutched my phone, the 911 operator still on the line. "They are trying to break in through the back door," I told her, voice shaking. The sound of breaking glass confirmed it. Heavy footsteps crossed our kitchen tile. Dad positioned himself between me and the approaching intruders, his expression carved from stone. The change in him was absolute, the transition from retired father to SEAL operator happening in the space between heartbeats. "Get in the safe room," he ordered quietly. "Lock the door. Do not open it unless you hear the code phrase." "Dad, I cannot leave you out here alone," I protested. "This is not a discussion." Authority resonated in each syllable. "Execute the plan we discussed." I backed toward the safe room door. Through the kitchen doorway, I caught a glimpse of the first intruder, black tactical gear, face mask, gloved hands gripping what appeared to be a real firearm. Dad stood in the living room, facing the threat, completely still except for his controlled breathing. "Armed individuals have breached our home," I whispered to the dispatcher. "Please tell officers to hurry." The first intruder entered our living room, weapon raised. "On the ground, hands where I can see them," he shouted. Dad did not move. "You are trespassing in my home with a deadly weapon," he stated calmly. "Lower your weapon immediately or I will consider this a threat to my life and respond accordingly." The intruder advanced, seeming surprised by the lack of fear. "HOA enforcement, get down now." What happened next occurred so quickly I barely processed it. Dad moved like liquid, economy of motion honed through thousands of hours of training. He stepped inside the weapon's path, controlling the intruder's arm with practiced precision. The man cried out in pain as Dad disarmed him in one fluid motion. Two more intruders rushed in from the kitchen. Dad maintained control of the first man, using him as a barrier while assessing the new threats. I backed into the safe room, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the dispatcher asking for updates. "3 armed men inside our home," I managed to say. "My father is a retired Navy SEAL. There is going to be violence. Please hurry." Through the closing door of the safe room, I saw Dad engage the second intruder who swung a collapsible baton toward his head. Dad deflected the strike and redirected the man's momentum. The intruder crashed into our dining room wall with enough force to crack the plaster. The third intruder hesitated, clearly not expecting trained resistance. Dad's voice carried through the house with commanding authority. "You have entered the wrong home. Stand down now." I secured the safe room door as the sounds of struggle intensified. Our living room had become a battlefield, furniture overturning, glass breaking, men shouting in confusion and pain. But through it all, Dad remained in control, his military training transforming our home into terrain he knew how to dominate. Inside the safe room, I activated the security monitors that Dad had installed. 4 camera feeds showed different angles of our home. The living room had become a battlefield. Dad moved with precision and control, not wild or panicked, but methodical, as if following protocols established through decades of training. The first intruder lay on the ground, zip-tied and immobilized. The second struggled to rise from where he had impacted the wall. The third had backed toward the kitchen, clearly reassessing the situation. A fourth figure appeared from the back door, advancing cautiously with what looked like a real handgun partially raised. Through the safe room door, I could hear Dad's voice, not raised but carrying the unmistakable authority of command. "Drop your weapons and lie face down on the floor. You are committing armed home invasion." "We have HOA authority," one shouted back, voice tinged with uncertainty. "HOA authority does not override constitutional rights," Dad responded. "You have illegally entered a private residence with deadly weapons. Make no mistake about what you are doing right now." I kept the 911 dispatcher updated, describing the scene unfolding on the monitors. 4 intruders, at least 2 visibly armed. My father is defending our home. Please inform responding officers that he is a retired Navy SEAL protecting us from home invaders. On the monitor, I watched as the 4th intruder raised his weapon toward Dad. My heart stopped. Dad reacted instantly, moving into the man's space before he could properly aim. A precise strike to the wrist sent the weapon clattering to the floor. The intruder countered with a wild punch that Dad easily avoided before executing a control technique that brought the man to his knees. "4th Battalion Pacific Deployment," Dad said calmly, examining a tattoo visible on the man's neck as he secured him. "Dishonorable discharge. You should know better than this." The man's eyes widened in shock. "How did you?" "Because I served with men who earned their titles," Dad replied, securing the man's wrists with another zip tie from the collection he carried. "Not pretenders who sell their training to the highest bidder." The 2nd intruder had regained his feet and charged Dad with a roar of anger, collapsible baton raised. Dad pivoted, redirecting the man's momentum into the coffee table. Wood splintered under the impact. Before the man could recover, Dad had him secured as well. The 3rd intruder made a break for the back door. Dad let him go, focusing instead on controlling the immediate threats and securing the area. He quickly collected the dropped weapons, ejecting magazines and clearing chambers with practiced efficiency. With 3 intruders neutralized, Dad approached the safe room. "Primary threat contained. Alpha protocol complete," he said, our predetermined signal that it was safe to open the door. I emerged with my phone still connected to emergency services. Dad directed me to begin documenting the scene. Video, everything. Every face, every weapon, every piece of identification. I moved through the house, recording as instructed. The intruders wore uniforms with patches reading HOA Enforcement Division and carried badges resembling police credentials. One had dropped a document titled Emergency Inspection Authorization with Richard Mercer's signature. While recording, I overheard Dad questioning the subdued intruders. Their answers revealed a pattern that chilled me to the core. This was not the first home they had invaded. They described midnight intimidation of families who challenged HOA authority, confiscation of evidence, psychological warfare through implied threats. The HOA president paid them in cash and property fee waivers. "How many houses?" Dad asked, voice controlled but carrying dangerous undercurrents. 7 this month, admitted the man Dad had identified as ex-military. Mostly just scaring people into compliance. Never had anyone fight back before. "Because you targeted vulnerable families," Dad observed. "Single parents, elderly couples, people who could not defend themselves." The man had the decency to look ashamed. It was just supposed to be intimidation, make them fall in line or move out. Dad secured the weapons in a location where the intruders could not reach them. He maintained a professional demeanor throughout, never excessive in his force or language, every action measured and controlled. This was not rage or revenge. This was a professional handling threats according to his training. In the distance, Police sirens wailed, growing louder. The sound triggered visible panic in the restrained intruders. The fourth man, whom Dad had identified by his tattoo, began speaking rapidly. "Look, this is all a misunderstanding. We were just following orders. Mercer pays us to handle problem residents. Says he has connections with the police commissioner. We just need to scare people into compliance with HOA rules." Dad did not respond to the man's attempt at justification. Instead, he methodically documented each intruder's identification, photographing faces and any credentials they carried. He collected the dropped weapons, securing them while ensuring the video captured serial numbers and details. As the police sirens grew closer, the mood of the intruders shifted from confidence to concern. One began trying to loosen his restraints. Dad noticed immediately. "I would not recommend that," he stated calmly. "Those are military-grade zip ties properly applied. Your circulation is safe, but you will not be free until properly released." The flashing blue lights of police cruisers filtered through our windows. Dad moved to the front door, hands visible, preparing to explain the situation to responding officers. His breathing remained steady, the controlled rhythm of a professional who had faced worse odds in desert storms and mountain passes thousands of miles from home. "Stay behind me," he instructed me quietly. "Keep recording but maintain distance from the doorway. When the officers enter, follow all instructions immediately." The night that had begun with unauthorized invaders claiming HOA authority was about to enter a new phase, one where real law enforcement would have to sort through the chaos and determine who had actually broken the law. As multiple patrol cars pulled up outside, Dad stood tall despite the pain I knew his back must be causing him. He had defended our home with the same precision and control that had made him legendary in military circles, using no more force than necessary, but exactly as much as required. Blue lights strobed across our ransacked living room as the first officers entered with weapons drawn. The scene before them defied easy categorization. 4 men in tactical gear restrained on the floor, furniture overturned, and a gray-haired man standing calmly with hands visible. "Officers, I am James Harrington, retired Navy SEAL," Dad announced clearly. "These 4 armed individuals forced entry into our home claiming to be HOA enforcement. I have subdued them using appropriate force. Their weapons are secured on the counter, magazines removed and chambers cleared." The officers maintained their defensive posture, processing the chaotic scene. "Everyone remain still," the lead officer commanded. "Sir, please keep your hands visible and move slowly to your knees." Dad complied without hesitation. "My son is recording from the hallway for documentation purposes," he explained calmly. "We contacted 911 immediately when these individuals attempted entry." The officers separated everyone, securing the scene with professional efficiency. Dad presented his military ID and retirement credentials. I showed them the security footage of the entire incident, starting with the intruders approaching our home through their forced entry. "They claim to have HOA authority for an emergency inspection," I explained. "They were armed and forced entry through our back door when we refused to let them in." The lead detective reviewed the footage twice, her expression darkening at the fake badges and real weapons. "This is not HOA enforcement," she stated firmly. "This is breaking and entering, assault, impersonating officials." One of the detained men, the one Dad had identified by his military tattoo, began offering information. "We were just following orders. Mercer pays us to handle problem residents. Call him. He will explain everything." The officers cataloged the weapons, 2 handguns and an expandable baton. One officer radioed in the serial numbers while another photographed the fake badges. "These look authentic at first glance," he noted, "deliberately designed to be confused with police identification." As the officers worked, the zip-tied intruder continued. "This is all a misunderstanding. We conduct compliance inspections for the HOA. Call Richard Mercer. He authorized this visit." Dawn was breaking when a luxury sedan pulled up outside. Richard Mercer emerged in an immaculate suit despite the early hour, flanked by a man he introduced as his attorney. His practiced smile faltered when he saw the patrol cars. "Officers, I can explain this unfortunate situation," he began smoothly. "These men are part of our HOA security team conducting a scheduled compliance inspection. The homeowner was notified in advance." I stepped forward, presenting the documentation I had organized over the past weeks. "That is false. We received harassment in the form of invalid citations and unscheduled inspections. These men forced entry with weapons at 3 in the morning." The detective examined the documentation carefully. Every harassing letter, every invalid fine, timestamps of strange vehicles captured on our security cameras. "Mr. Mercer, do you have documentation authorizing armed nighttime entry into private residences?" Mercer's attorney intervened. "My client oversees a legitimate homeowners association with authority to conduct compliance inspections according to bylaws that all residents agree to upon purchase." "HOA bylaws do not supersede state law regarding breaking and entering," the detective replied. "Nor do they authorize armed interventions." Her radio crackled with information from dispatch. "Detective, we have confirmation that one detained subject has outstanding warrants in Henderson County. Another appears to be in possession of an unregistered weapon." Mercer's phone rang. He stepped aside to answer, his posture stiffening as he listened. When he returned, the cordial demeanor had been replaced by cold confidence. "I have spoken with Police Commissioner Dawson," he stated, voice lowered. "He is a personal friend and golf partner. He assures me this matter will be handled administratively rather than criminally." The detective's expression did not change, but something shifted in the atmosphere. Dad recognized the look. He had seen corruption in war zones across the globe. The battle had changed from physical to political. "We will still need statements from all parties," the detective said carefully, "and these weapons will need to be processed." As officers continued collecting evidence and statements, I caught Dad's subtle nod toward the security cameras still recording every word, including Mercer's implied threat of political interference. By mid-morning, our living room had been photographed, measured, and documented. The intruders were taken away in patrol cars, not yet formally charged, but temporarily detained. Officers assured us they would remain in contact regarding the investigation. After the police left, Dad and I surveyed the damage. Broken glass from the back door, splintered coffee table, wall dented from impact, physical evidence of violence that had entered our home under the guise of community enforcement. "This is not over," Dad observed, surveying the destruction. "Mercer has connections. He will try to bury this." I nodded, understanding the implication. "But we have evidence. Video, documentation, witnesses." "Evidence only matters when the system works properly," Dad replied, the weariness of experience in his voice. "We need to prepare for what comes next." He was right. The physical confrontation had ended, but a different battle was just beginning. Later that day, we would understand just how far Mercer's influence extended and how determined he was to protect his position of power, even at the cost of our safety and freedom. The police investigation stalled almost immediately. Our calls for updates went unanswered. When I visited the station in person, the desk sergeant informed me that the case had been reassigned to administrative review, a bureaucratic black hole where cases disappeared without resolution. 1 week after the incident, the subdivision newsletter arrived in our mailbox. The front page featured a special edition about regrettable violence against community volunteers performing standard nighttime inspections. It described Dad and me as potentially unstable elements who had violently assaulted HOA representatives. Neighbors who had previously whispered warnings now crossed the street to avoid us. At the grocery store, conversations halted when I entered an aisle. Our home, once our sanctuary, began to feel like an island under siege. Character assassination, Dad observed calmly. Standard tactic when direct force fails. He spent hours on the phone, speaking in the shorthand of men who had shared foxholes in distant lands. Old teammates from his SEAL unit, men now working in federal agencies, private security, and military intelligence. Information began flowing back through these trusted networks. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Richard Mercer's private security firm had contracts with the city. 3 council members had invested in his company. The police commissioner's son worked as a project manager for his corporate office. The web of connections explained the immediate stalling of the investigation and the coordinated narrative being spread throughout the community. Classic corruption structure, Dad explained. I have seen it in developing nations after conflict. Private security becomes unofficial enforcement for those with power. The system protects itself. An emergency HOA meeting was called. The community center filled to capacity. Dad and I attended despite knowing what to expect. Richard Mercer stood at the podium, presenting a carefully crafted narrative about aggressive homeowners threatening community standards. When I approached the microphone during public comments, it mysteriously cut out. 3 attempts, 3 failures. Meanwhile, selected residents delivered practice statements about feeling unsafe because of our violent tendencies. Dad sat perfectly still throughout the meeting, scanning faces, identifying the few showing doubt versus those already converted to the false narrative. His eyes narrowed slightly as he observed Mercer's body language, the subtle tells of someone accustomed to unchallenged authority. The meeting concluded with a vote to enhance security measures and increase HOA fees to cover additional protection services. No mention of armed men invading homes at night. No acknowledgement of falsified violations. Just the machinery of corruption grinding forward, crushing truth beneath its wheels. That evening, returning from work, I found an envelope in our mailbox. No return address, no postmark. Inside, photographs of me at work, at the grocery store, at the gas station, all with timestamps from the past week. No note accompanied the images. None was needed. The message was clear: we are watching you. Dad received a similar delivery, a letter threatening to contact the VA about his mental instability and dangerous behavior, suggesting his benefits might be reviewed. Standard intimidation tactics designed to silence opposition. Neither had the intended effect. Rather than fear, I felt righteous anger growing. Dad's expression showed something I had rarely seen, not fear, but the cold calculation of a strategic mind processing threats and formulating responses. They are using civilian intimidation tactics, he observed, carefully placing the surveillance photos in a folder with our growing evidence. Because they do not know how to fight a real war. That night we discussed our options. Leaving would be easiest, selling the house, moving to another community, starting fresh. Many families had chosen that path, allowing Mercer's corruption to continue unchallenged. Tactical retreat is sometimes necessary, Dad acknowledged, but only when it serves the larger mission. I understood what he meant. This had become more than our personal battle. If Mercer's operation continued, how many more families would suffer similar intimidation? How many communities would fall under the control of private security forces operating outside the law? So we fight, I concluded. Dad nodded, his expression shifting to one I imagined enemy combatants had seen before operations that would later be classified. We fight, but we fight smart. We fight to win. We transformed our dining room into a tactical operations center. Maps of the neighborhood marked with surveillance points. Timelines of harassment incidents. Statements from terrified neighbors who whispered their experiences after dark, slipping notes under our door or speaking in hushed tones at the grocery store. Dad approached this like any mission behind enemy lines, methodical, patient, comprehensive. A lifetime of military operations had taught him that emotions were poor tactical advisors. Information was the true weapon. His former unit's intelligence officer provided guidance on documenting chain of custody for evidence. Everything must be preserved correctly, Dad explained. Dates, times, locations, all verified and cross-referenced. A teammate now working for the FBI offered advice on which agencies had jurisdiction. Local police are compromised, but state-level agencies operate independently. The Attorney General's office handles public corruption cases. We moved carefully, building an irrefutable case while appearing to surrender. We stopped attending HOA meetings. We paid the illegitimate fines without complaint. We maintained our property to excessive standards, removing any pretense for inspections. The HOA president grew confident, believing his intimidation had succeeded. That confidence became his vulnerability. Richard Mercer began speaking openly about his methods at private gatherings, conversations recorded by sympathetic servers and bartenders who had faced similar harassment in their own neighborhoods. Through Dad's network, we connected with 3 other subdivisions where Mercer's security firm had contracts. Similar patterns emerged: intimidation, selective enforcement, midnight visits to problem residents. One family had video of armed men searching their garage while they were on vacation. Another had audio of threats made against their children if they continued causing trouble. Dad's former communications specialist helped us create secure channels for sharing information. Neighbors who had been silenced found their voices, sharing experiences dating back years, all documenting a pattern of organized intimidation using HOA authority as cover. Information warfare, Dad explained as we organized the evidence. Control the narrative, control the outcome. The operation unfolded with military precision, multiple fronts, synchronized timing, overwhelming evidence. The state attorney general received our complete dossier through official channels, hundreds of pages of documentation, dozens of witness statements, financial records showing irregularities in HOA fund management. Simultaneously, selected video clips reached investigative journalists through anonymous submissions. The most damning showed Mercer himself instructing his enforcement team on intimidation tactics, recorded during a training session by a team member who had developed ethical concerns. The first news story broke on a Tuesday morning. By afternoon, 3 more outlets had picked up the investigation. By evening, The state attorney general's office issued a statement confirming an active investigation into alleged abuse of authority and possible racketeering charges. Richard Mercer responded with characteristic confidence, calling a press conference to dismiss the allegations as disgruntled homeowners seeking to undermine community standards. His practiced smile faltered only once, when a reporter asked specifically about the video showing him instructing armed men on entering homes without warrants. When state investigators arrived at Mercer's home with search warrants, they discovered financial records linking him to construction kickbacks, insurance fraud, and embezzlement of community funds. The HOA enforcement team scattered, loyalty evaporating when faced with conspiracy charges. The final neighborhood meeting was held under state supervision. The community center filled beyond capacity. Officials from the Attorney General's office explained the investigation findings: systematic corruption extending beyond our subdivision to multiple communities under Mercer's influence. Neighbors who had shunned us now approached with tearful apologies and their own stories. The Richardson family returned from across state lines to provide testimony. Mrs. Winters from across the street brought forward years of meticulous notes documenting suspicious activities. The community that had been divided by fear began to heal through shared truth. The rebuilding process began with the formation of a resident committee committed to transparency. Financial audits revealed hundreds of thousands in misappropriated funds. Insurance investigations uncovered fraudulent claims filed after manufactured emergencies. Construction contracts showed systematic kickbacks for unnecessary repairs and improvements. As criminal proceedings against Mercer and his associates progressed, our neighborhood slowly reclaimed its sense of community. Genuine violations were addressed reasonably. Legitimate maintenance was performed without intimidation. The black SUVs disappeared from our streets. Dad watched these developments from the periphery, satisfaction visible only in the subtle relaxation of his vigilant posture. He had no interest in community leadership or public recognition. His mission had been accomplished, the threat neutralized, the community secured. The objective was never revenge, he told me one evening as we sat on the porch watching children play freely in yards that had once been under surveillance. The objective was to secure the community against threats, just like any mission. As reconstruction of the homeowners association began, neighbors approached me about taking a leadership role. Dad nodded his approval when I mentioned the possibility. The lessons of confronting corruption and standing firm against intimidation had transformed not just our neighborhood, but my understanding of what it means to fight for something greater than yourself. The system that had been weaponized against residents became a model of transparency and proper governance. The security cameras that once monitored for imaginary violations now served their proper purpose: actual community safety, controlled by ethical oversight. When the first anniversary of the night invasion arrived, our neighborhood held a community gathering, not to dwell on past corruption, but to celebrate its defeat. Families who had been targeted shared stories they had once been too frightened to tell. Dad was asked to speak but characteristically declined, preferring to remain in the background. "Some fights choose you," he said privately as we walked home afterward. "The important thing is being prepared when they do." The legal proceedings concluded with multiple convictions. Richard Mercer received a substantial prison sentence for racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. His enforcement team members received lesser sentences in exchange for testimony. The corrupt network that had terrorized multiple communities was dismantled completely. Our house still bears subtle scars from that night, reinforced door frames, impact-resistant windows, security features disguised as ordinary fixtures. But they serve as reminders that standing against corruption requires both courage and preparation. Other communities reached out for guidance as similar patterns emerged elsewhere. Dad helped draft security protocols and governance standards that protected homeowner rights while maintaining legitimate community standards. His military experience found new purpose in civilian protection. The final chapter came when state legislators passed what became known as the Homeowner Protection Act, establishing clear limitations on HOA authority and enforcement methods. Dad was invited to testify during hearings, offering his perspective on the difference between genuine community standards and weaponized authority. Looking back now, years later, I understand that what happened in our neighborhood was never really about property values or lawn maintenance or trash can placement. It was about power, its proper use, and its corrupt abuse. My father, who had defended freedom in distant lands, found himself fighting the same battle on American soil, in a suburban neighborhood that had forgotten the principles it claimed to uphold. The lessons remain with me daily. That systems meant to protect can become weapons when corrupted. That standing against intimidation requires both courage and strategy. And that the most important victories often happen not on battlefields, but in ordinary places where people refuse to surrender their rights to fear. Our neighborhood thrives now under transparent governance and genuine community spirit. The nightmare of armed men invading homes at night has become a cautionary tale rather than an ongoing threat. And my father, who once utilized his training to defend our home, now enjoys true retirement, watching sunsets from our porch, secure in the knowledge that the mission was completed successfully, the community protected, justice served.